Hello, welcome everyone. It's good to see all of you. Happy Thursday. All right, waiting for a couple more people to come in from the waiting room. But as I mentioned earlier this week and before that, I'm very excited that we get to have a guest speaker today, Cynthia Bauer, who I'll introduce in just a moment, to talk with us about the work that she's been doing, I would say both in the United States and in Kenya, and advocating for the rights of children with disabilities. Cynthia and I think we've now been working together for about 2 years. I met Jessica Charles, who's the development director of Kupenda, at the American Public Health Association conference back in the fall of 2018. And she had attended one of my presentations where I was talking about like stigma reduction and mitigation strategies. And we started chatting about, figuring out how to do a research project together. So we've been doing some research, which we can maybe touch on the end, but it's been a really wonderful experience. And Cynthia is the executive director and co-founder of Kupenda. And she has a really fascinating background. So she's a wildlife biologist by training, and that's what originally brought her to Kenya. And then Cindy, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I recall from the story that you would walk past what is now the Getty School on your way to the forest to do your research. And that is how she met Leonard Mbanani, who's the Kenya executive director, who was a special education teacher working at a small school for children living with disabilities in Kilifi County, Kenya, which is on the coast. It's also a really beautiful region in Kenya. So Cindy and I got to travel there together in January of last year before all the pandemic craziness happened. And we got to start our project, which was working with traditional healers in this part of Kenya on stigma and stereotype mitigation work, and to help improve access to education and healthcare services for children in their communities. But Kupenda's work covers a really broad range of target groups and populations. They work with local networks of pastors. They've worked with local community leaders, village chiefs, policymakers, traditional healers, families. So they have very comprehensive programs really targeted at changing belief systems around disability causation and treatment, and to better improve access for children to all of these important and necessary services, so that kids are truly able to, fulfill their rights to health and to education, and to live lives where they're, truly members of their communities. So I also just wanted to mention that I've seen Cynthia in action, and she's a wonderful advocate for people living with disabilities. It's been a true joy getting to work with her and Kupenda, and I'm very excited for y'all to meet her today and to hear a bit more about the work of her organization. So Cynthia, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. And John, it's fun to see you on there. John's been working with us for a little while now. I'm going to share my screen. I'm not going to say too much before I actually ask you some questions that I think that you're going to be broken out into breakout groups, because I just want to get an idea from you. If we were in person, I'd be doing a lot of back and forth, and I'm still going to try. But Kupenda for the Children its mission is to transform harmful beliefs about disability to those that improve lives, because so often there is a large amount of stigma about people with disabilities. And I don't want to go too much into that, because I want to find out, without influencing you, what your answers are to these questions. And then I'd love for you to come back and talk about it. So I think that Dr. Quissell did a really great job of introducing the work and what we're doing. And before we really get into things, I'd love to know what you guys think. And I want to also make a rule: you're not allowed to Google anything. Just, I want you to tell me like what comes to mind, because it's not a test. It's to see like what is the mindset of people in the classroom to begin with as we start this. So I think that's where we're going next.
All right, so Cynthia, we can't see your slides yet.
Oh, I thought I shared it. Sorry, I totally thought I was sharing a slide. Let me go back and For some reason, I've been doing this forever, and I can't believe I forgot to share it. There we go. Okay.
It's popping up now. Perfect.
There
Yeah,
you
sorry,
go. So these are
Zoom
the
can be really
questions.
clunky. Yeah, so what we'll do first is I'll get you into your project teams and breakout rooms. And as Cynthia described, if you as a team could come up with a definition of disability, or what comes to mind when you think of disability, and then think about some of the challenges encountered in the United States and in countries such as Kenya. So if you can brainstorm some answers to these questions, we'll bring everybody back and chat about it a bit. So also, nominate a person from your team who will report back what you discussed. So we'll probably, Cynthia, how much time do you want to give them to discuss? Like 5-ish minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes, 10, however much you think they need. I don't know if you pop into the breakout rooms or how that works, but yeah. Let's go with 5. And
Okay.
if they need a little more time, hopefully they have, just because I mean, if it was a smaller class, I'd just throw out these questions and have you guys pop up and answer.
Yeah, that sounds great. So Emma and I can also pop in and touch base with a couple groups to see how they're doing on time. All right. So does everybody feel good with the questions you're going to answer? I'll open up the breakout rooms.
If I keep it on here, will they be able to see it?
Not in breakout rooms. And actually, I just
Oh, that's
noticed, Emma, I'm going to make you host for a second. There are a bunch of students who are not assigned to breakout rooms for some reason. Would you mind putting them in? You always got to love Zoom curveballs.
Of course. Because sometimes you can put them in the chat too. I don't know the questions, or they can just take a picture of the slide before.
Mm-hmm. And actually, if you all, do you remember your team numbers? I don't know if you have it like memorized by number. Looks like Emma is making progress though. Thank you, Emma.
Okay, that might be.
I was invited to join a room. I'll just say not now, Emma.
Yeah. Sorry about that. That should be everyone.
There we go.
I don't think I got assigned to the right group. I think I'm team 4 maybe, with John and Natalie.
Okay.
Yeah, that is team 4.
Sorry, Nina. 1 second.
That's okay, no worries. Thank you.
I'm a little new to this. You said you were team 4, Nina?
Yes.
Okay. I'm so sorry. 1 second. I'm having a hard time with this, Professor Quissell. I'm sorry.
Do you need to reassign them?
Yeah.
If you want, I mean, you can make me host again. And
Oh, wait. So, okay, I got it. So team 4, Nina, again? That's what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. It should be good.
Yeah, Lauren should be in team 5.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I was assigned to room 8 at first, but I believe I'm supposed to be in 5.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's totally my fault. Okay, got it.
Great. Oops, she's still there. Oh, there we go.
So I think what happens is, so Zoom, usually I have students like authenticate themselves so that they have to log in through their UVA emails. And then I had to take that off so that you could get in today, Cindy. And so I think a lot of students now are not officially like logged in through UVA.
Oh, so they might have logged in just for their other emails.
Yeah. And so if they're not in under UVA, their UVA email address is what's used to assign them to breakout rooms. So I think that's what. So
the things you just don't think about. That's so
No.
well,
thank you, Emma.
Sorry about, yeah, that was the first time I've actually assigned anyone to breakout rooms. So I was
Good job
a little
then.
new to that.
I always feel like it's so magical when we're like all of a sudden in different little rooms and
Poof.
yeah.
It's always so funny bouncing around because I always feel awkward when I just show
Mhm.
up and
Yeah.
other people are talking.
I don't know how you guys feel. Like, Katie, do you travel a lot normally, or
Mhm.
just maybe? Yeah, I feel like I'm having an opposite response to this whole not traveling. I'm like, I don't actually need to travel. Like, I'm starting to get to a point. I'm like, maybe I don't need to do it anymore. This is
Yeah.
just fine with me. I can just
Yeah.
meet people through the computer.
It's been fine for some things. But there's other stuff where I'm just like, I mean, it's also because we've been really restrictive because of my son's health. Like we've
Yeah.
gone nowhere and done nothing.
Oh,
Where
that's different. Yeah.
I think it's like that. And I'm just like, I just miss terrible airport layovers, like things that I used to hate. Like I just think about like
You
our trip,
miss
on,
terrible. Okay.
like our trip through Charles de Gaulle on the way to Kenya. And I just like spent the whole day with swollen ankles working. And I was like, oh, but I could like eat French pastries and like be alone.
That's true. That's true. That especially because you have little kids too. Yeah, getting to have that. I wonder about flying though, and how miserable it would be right now, given
Yeah.
because didn't you say that like your friend flying through from Ethiopian Air or something, they weren't going to have food for like the whole 17-hour flight or something? No, that was someone else. A friend of mine in Tanzania.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it'd be pretty miserable right now.
Mhm. I started to look forward to airplanes just for like you said, no one can bother you and you just have to watch movies and drink wine because I'm not very good at working on planes. It's too cramped of a space. I'm like, oh, I have an excuse. I don't have to do anything. But if I can't drink wine, and you can't eat or drink, or how do you do it through a straw? I don't know how that works with the masks and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, a lot of people are just like taking them off during certain parts of like the flight.
Yeah.
Which is, I think it just like the anxiety around that would
Hmm.
be too much. Have you been able to get your vaccine yet?
In Massachusetts, it's opened up to the general public April 19th. So not until then. I don't have anything that
Yeah.
qualifies because even in some states higher, because I do teach a college level course, but in Massachusetts, it's only K through 12 that
included.
gets a priority. Yeah, universities. I think because there's so many. If you did that in Massachusetts, it would really open up a lot considering Boston. But yeah, but the vulnerable people in my life are
That's good.
vaccinated. I think my mom and my 96-year-old grandmother yesterday both got their second shot.
That's awesome.
And my niece, who's the one I've been very careful for, she unfortunately passed away, which has been really rough. But she was 9 and had cancer, so I was very careful. And then after she passed, I'm like, I feel like I'll just go lick doorknobs. I don't care.
At this point,
I'm like, who cares?
she was my. I mean, it's so funny. Like when you're doing it to like for somebody else, it makes it in many ways easier. I feel like that with my son.
Yeah.
Like if it were just for me, I'd probably still be very cautious. But like I would have gotten a haircut a really long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing. I go to the grocery stores now. I was doing ordering for a while because of her, but now because they let me actually even be in the hospital with her
That's
as
good.
another caretaker, which I thought was crazy because all they did was ask me if I had a temperature and that kind of thing and would give me a mask. I'm like, and then they just let me be in the room with her. I'm like, that's kind of crazy to me that they weren't more cautious. Yeah, it was Boston Children's Hospital, but I was grateful to be able to be there too at the same time.
Emma, do you want to either make me host again or broadcast a message to see how teams are doing?
Sure. Maybe I'll make you host. Do you know how to do that?
Yep, I do.
Okay.
Also, I was having technical difficulties, so I got off the call, but I'm back fine.
Do you need to, why don't you just stay here? Because I think we're going to bring everybody back.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, I'm going to make you host, Professor Quissell.
Okay. I wish there could be like multiple hosts.
I know.
Can there only be one at a time?
Yeah, and so it's always like swapping back and forth.
Yeah.
Because it looks like I'm also a host because I keep seeing the admit thing too.
Yeah, so there's certain things that co-hosts can see, and only certain functions that like only one host can do.
Okay.
So that's been also like the learning curve,
I
figuring
see.
out like what you actually have the ability to control or not.
Mhm.
Um, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and close the rooms and bring them back.
I always feel weird when I'm in the breakout rooms and they have the countdown, and I'm always like, what can we do like in
know.
that period of time? I'm like, we're all just looking at the countdown
Yeah.
instead of, can we still talk? Like, how does that even work? In some ways, we have more access to more international forums because of the pandemic, like without having to fly. I was supposed to go to Denmark, which would have been fun, but you know, there's just so many more people, especially if they can access technology from low-income countries that are able to participate because there's not traveling, because a lot of them couldn't afford to participate in some of these forums if they had to fly there.
That is true. It has made it's like definitely some global interactions a bit easier to have and maintain and cheaper, which is always nice.
Yeah, very much so.
All right, I think we've got everyone back. Welcome back. We were troubleshooting the breakout room snafus, but hopefully you were able to have good conversations around these beginning discussion topics. So why don't we start then with some teams reporting back on sort of defining disability? What were your thoughts around, defining it as a term or thinking through things that come to mind when you think of disabilities? Maybe we can address those two questions all together. Go ahead and raise your hand if you want to volunteer. Otherwise, I'll just pick a room number. Eleni.
Yeah, so we're group 7. And so we were talking when it comes to disability, the idea of in groups and out groups, like how people who have like intellectual or physical or whatever challenges and disabilities often tend to be classified as out groups, and so they tend to face social exclusion from those who are sorry, I'm blanking on the word, who are able-bodied. So kind of just, again, social stigma is something that really came up and we talked about a lot, but really just also a lack of like education about certain things, which helps facilitate that division between in groups and out groups. So I think we thought that a lot of it just boils down to kind of social exclusion and really just people not understanding like what disabilities actually are. So.
Yeah, thank you. Courtney, I think your hand was next.
Yeah, so our group talked a lot about specifically like as a function of society and structure. So disability is defined by what you can and can't access in your society, particularly in if you grow up in a society that has a lot of like eye doctors, then being visually impaired is not a disability. Whereas like, basically just like disability as a function of society and structure.
Yeah, fantastic. And thanks for bringing that, because I know that's one thing that Cynthia wanted to talk about too, some of the differences between what we think of as sort of like biomedical or social aspects to disability and access. Brittany, I think your hand was next.
Yeah, so our group tried to define disability, and what we came up with was physical or mental impairments that challenge normal functioning within society. And then when we were trying to think about what came to mind when thinking about disability, immediately we thought of like accessibility and parking. And then we started thinking about controversy surrounding how you define disability itself. And we talked about the deaf community, and how some people consider deafness as a disability and some don't. So that was what we talked about.
Really interesting. Lauren, what about your team?
Yeah, we also talked about disability as something that's defined or created like as a social structure, and how we often define disability in relation to like a baseline normal, but like that baseline normal is what's created by society and not necessarily like an objective standard. Talking about how a lot of times disability is related to like what we perceive to be normal, though there's not actually like but again, that like varies by society. And then we kind of talked about how ableism is like so casually entrenched into like so many different structures, and how it's, I think, like a form of harm that a lot of us don't know how to engage with, or like know how to think critically about, because like, of course, there's a lot of like necessary conversation. For example, like I feel like a lot of people know how to talk about like sexism and can recognize that, but like ableism is something that we tend to either gloss over or see as something that's like not as relevant, I think, or like not as important, because I think people just like assume that these are barriers are like easier to overcome, or like maybe not even barriers at all, because they just like don't. I think this comes down to a lot of different things, but like particularly with ableism, it's just like so easy for us to be like that's not that big of a deal, or like, oh, somebody else will come along and fix that, or like if it's not gonna, like when you think about like utility, for example, like what are we putting in to fix this one thing that like I guess the majority of people don't have to deal with is like ableism. But I think a lot of people like just don't recognize that. And then I think we also talked about how a lot of people feel like people are obligated to like disclose their disabilities or like explain them in some way, and they feel like for some reason they have some sort of like, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but they feel like they just have like autonomy over other people's like disability, or yeah, just like that weird like relationship between people who are able-bodied in whatever that is defined as in our society.
Thanks so much. I would say, like, I appreciate all of your answers, and they're very well thought out. And I would say there's a lot of parallels, and we can talk about this too, between ableism and racism. And I often parallel ableism with my experience of racism, having grown up as a white person in New Hampshire. One of the challenges for me is I just didn't know what challenges existed for people of color because of where I was and how I was isolated. And I was always very surprised when I moved to other areas of the world and had my friends of color telling me things that had happened to them. And I was just shocked. The same thing is often true with people with disabilities. When I tell people, because I'm missing a hand, when I go jogging, people still clap for me. Like people are like, what? You know, like I think it's the whole, I think that for disabilities, and one of the reasons it's not as much part of the conversation when we talk about all the isms out there, is because I don't think a lot of our society has actually heard from the voices of disabled people to talk about the experiences that they've had. Because that's the starting point, really, is even knowing what they are. So I'm excited to hear what your next answers are.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear a bit from the team, because I think with these discussions about social structures and problems of ableism, I think that points to, for these second questions, like really, important sets of challenges, some of which might exist in all countries regardless of income status. But income status of the country might also affect, for example, like accessibility in certain ways. So what are some things that you talked about in your teams related to these last two questions? Yeah, Natalie.
We talked generally about accessibility and how that differs between high-income countries and low-income countries, and how, depending on where you are and what kind of policies exist, accessibility can look different. And even the fact of having a sidewalk that's amenable to wheels is a big deal in certain areas. But we also talked about discrimination in the workplace and in hiring, and how disabilities are defined in different ways depending on the hiring process, and how in some ways, in the workplace, it's getting better, and there are policies that are pushing toward, inclusion. But at the same time, we also discussed invisible disabilities and how there are certain chronic illnesses that are overlooked. We talked a little bit about Crohn's disease and how certain people struggle with that in everyday life, but that isn't considered a disability in the eyes of many people. When in fact, it's really not their place to define what a disability is. It's the person with the disability that has that power. So we just talked a little bit about all those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Isabel.
Yeah, so our group talked a lot about sort of like the invisible ones, like she just went off to, about especially with like mental health and how it's sort of this ability to make people believe you almost. And that's like a big challenge, especially in like schools and among like your social circles, like trying to make people believe that you do have these like mental issues. And then also for I don't know if we're on the low income country question yet, but we talked.
Yeah, you can.
We talked a lot about, especially with the reading safety in low income countries, like a lot of disability, people with disabilities are outcasted or they're even discriminated against, and they have a lot of like safety implications with that.
Yeah, and I think there's potentially some differences in sort of severity of outcomes for discrimination. That discrimination is, again, like a more universal phenomenon, but it may manifest in different ways, and the consequences of it might differ depending on location. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting conversation. And Regina, did you have anything else you wanted to add in, or was another point already stated?
Well, I was like just gonna say a little more on like invisible disabilities and also kind of like mental health and how those can sometimes be like culturally interpreted as well. And like for example, like depression or like anxiety like could affect someone's everyday life, but in certain cultures it might not be something that's like socially accepted or like talked about.
Yeah, thank you. Cynthia, do you want to add?
Yeah, thank you so much for all that. And we can talk a little bit more about that kind of thing about the invisible versus the visible, which I would say there's different challenges for both. I have struggled a lot with the visible disability, and I'm often in a place of trying to prove to people what I can do, where I have had friends who have more invisible disabilities that have to prove to people that they actually aren't able to do certain things, and they are challenged. Like some of my friends, I have two friends with muscular sclerosis, and like one of them, like her husband doesn't understand why she's so tired all the time because she looks quote unquote like anybody else, but it's hard because you have to more explain those kinds of things. And her, that's not even, I mean, and then when you get into the area of emotional illness, challenge, mental health challenges, those kinds of things, there's even more stigma. So what most of my focus is on disability in low income countries, but there is more commonality between disability issues in low income countries and developed countries than you might think. So I think for some reason, there we go. So we talked about the definition of disability. So I'm going to give you, because we're in the United States, I'm going to talk about the definition before we talk more about this. I'm going to give you the legal definition in the United States, which is very similar to the United Nations Disability Act, which is the convention and what they decided, as well as the same that most countries around the world have very similar language. But there's two parts of the Disability Act that are really important. So the first part says a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or a person who has a history or a record of such an impairment. That's the first part. And what I often do when I'm doing workshops in Kenya, and I actually do them a lot with when I talk to little kids, I ask people, and I found that in college levels and older, people are uncomfortable when I ask, what is it by looking at me you think I can't do? People aren't always comfortable answering it. So I'll just tell you that in Kenya, even when I'm working with little kids, they'll say things like, oh, you can't drive a car. In Kenya, they've even said, and also we work in Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Zambia, and Tanzania too. And in those countries, when I ask them that question, they'll say things like, even like, I can't wash clothes, I can't do a lot of the African things like carry water on my head, a lot of things that are seen as like a typical task that a woman should be able to do. Someone even said they didn't think I could bathe myself, which I told them to come and smell me because I do. But the thing is, ultimately, when it comes to this part of the definition, and the reason I ask is because of the second part, but according to the first part of this definition of disability, the only thing I am not truly capable of physically that I know of is to do a handstand. And maybe if I worked out really well, I could do a single-handed one, I'm not sure. But that's just really the only thing physically. But if you go to the second part, and I really appreciated how many of you talked about society and how society defines disability, because the second part of the definition is, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. And that's why I ask people what they think I'm capable of or not capable of, because it proves the second part of the definition applies to me. The majority of people, when you see someone who's missing a hand, assume that I'm not able, that I'm substantially limited in one or more major life activity. And last time I knew, a handstand was not a major life activity. So I think that that's where I think I appreciate how you guys were talking about societal constructs. And for a long time, there were, and still now, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who subscribe to what we call the medical model of disability. You'll often find disability under health, which sometimes is appropriate for some, but more and more it's being phrased as a social justice issue in the same way as race and gender and so on. Because someone like me, for example, who's missing an arm and legally being defined as having a disability, I don't have any health issues. So the medical construct would say more that people with disabilities need to become more like the people without disabilities, that they need to change to fit into society, as opposed to the social model, which says that society needs to be adjusted to accommodate people with disabilities. So if you have a set of stairs and a person with a wheelchair, is it that the person is unable to go up the stairs, or that the stairs are not accessible to the person with the disability? And so in everything we do, if you ever get a chance to watch the movie Crip Camp, you'll see the civil rights movement of disability in the United States on Netflix. Also, if you read about Judy Heumann, who was a major leader in the disability rights movement in the United States, she talked about that. And when we actually made more accessibility for people with wheelchairs, it also happened to help people with little kids using strollers. It was like beneficial for everyone when you actually make it more accessible. But around the world, there at least are 1 in 7 people with disabilities, about 15%, and that's according to the World Health Organization, but the chances are it's much more than that. In the United States, currently in the United States, 23% of the population is considered to have a disability. So we know that it's very likely it's at least that, if not higher, in low-income countries, because there's more disease, there's more work conditions, abuse, violence that cause disabilities. But around the world, people with disabilities are 98% illiterate, excluded from their religious communities. 83% experience sexual violence, 80% live in the developing world, they're orphaned, and 60% are children. We couldn't get the data, but we do know that they're very vulnerable to human trafficking, because it's not like people, when they are human trafficked, come in with their disability certificate saying what they have. But we can tell you that 100% of people who have been trafficked are likely to have a disability, according to some of my friends who work in that world. And families are often abused and alienated in their communities. And part of that is because many people in low-income countries, and unfortunately I've discovered recently in my own personal experiences, it's here too, is that disability is often believed to be caused by curses, by infidelity, by the devil, by witchcraft. Even some people think that disability is caused by using contraceptives. So there's a lot of misinformation, and that leads to neglect, abuse, and even murder of children with disabilities. Often families will leave their children at home when they go to events. Children are locked in rooms, they're tied to trees, sometimes for their own safety. They're mean well, but people are just at a loss. And a lot of times the mothers are blamed for the disability as well. And they'll end up having really painful healing rituals done over them that are not helpful for them. And the biggest thing is just that alienation from society. And I learned about this when I was in Kenya, as Dr. Quissell said. This is me up in the corner with my field assistant studying this strange animal called the golden rumped elephant shrew. And then every day on my way to the forest, I passed the school that Leonard Mbanani, my friend, co-founder, and director in Kenya, had started a few years before. And we started with about 15 kids 20 years ago. And last year, we estimate our impact to be about 74,000 kids in 8 different countries because of the way that we're working, which I'll get to. And the reason that I did this is me now, 47 years ago, when with my parents. I was the firstborn in my family, and my parents were quite young. They were 22 and 24, and my dad actually had just become a Christian and was quite enthusiastic in such a way that he thought that if he had prayed hard enough and took me to faith healers, that I would actually grow a hand. And so it's, again, not as foreign as you think. And over time, my family, of course, my mom, who is the daughter of a Baptist preacher, was like, I think God might be able to use her in other ways. Perhaps this isn't the best, methodology. If she wants to go do that one day, she can. But, they encouraged me to do and try everything that I wanted to. I never felt limited. I was accepted by them, but I did experience a lot of things as anyone who looks different would. But it was when I learned that people with disabilities were often discriminated against and thought of as cursed. And I was told when I was in Kenya that if I had been born there, it's very likely I might have been killed, not just because they believed it was a curse on the family, but they had a misunderstanding of what I was capable of. They wouldn't have thought I could do things like this. This is me carrying water on my head. By the way, it's painful, caused my ears to ring, but I could do it luckily. And this is a little friend of mine in Kenya who was also born without her hand, and her family thought she would never be able to do the things that women traditionally did in the country. So I think that I also, when I was in Kenya at first, and I still do it somewhat, I think Dr. Quissell got to see me do this, is play guitar. I play left-handed guitar, and we, just to show like, to change what people think in terms of abilities around disability. But I wanted to do something and give people opportunities that maybe I didn't have. And that's when we started Kupenda. And Kupenda has 3 major areas. We have the focus of education, where we've sent kids to school, funded teachers, built classrooms, that kind of stuff. Where girls like Teresia, who lost her leg in an accident when a tree limb fell on top of her. She was in a coma, I believe, for 2 months, but she survived. She has a very high level amputation, and because it's so humid there, a prosthetic doesn't really work for her. But now she's actually a social worker working for the government and counseling families, not just families with disabilities, but all vulnerable families. We also have a medical component, mostly for emergency medical needs. We provide wheelchairs, that kind of thing, physical therapy, emergency surgeries. And this is a little boy named Athman, who has hydrocephalus, which is, you probably know, fluid on the brain. A lot of times this comes because of infections. And one of the things we did in his case is he had a shunt, a tube to get rid of that fluid, is it didn't seem like it was working. And the doctors were saying, there's nothing you can do. He's just going to die. And we pushed for that not to be the case, to keep looking into it. And what we discovered was what they thought was an infection from the shunt was actually that he was HIV positive. I'd never been so excited to hear that someone was HIV positive. And so he got the treatment for that, and he's still alive today. Where they just wanted to give up on him. And sometimes in medical communities, one of the issues that happens is doctors don't see anything past the disability. They don't think of, oh, this person might have other conditions that aren't related to the disability that you see. But our biggest component, and the part that Dr. Quissell has been working with us on, is our advocacy. And that includes, large scale events, counseling services, but mostly it's working with the local community and strategic leaders. Because when you think about witchcraft and curses and punishment for sin as the causes of disability that's commonly found in the communities, the question is, where do you go? Who are the ones propagating those belief systems? Why not go straight to them? And that's what we've been doing. We've been going to those leaders. So we work with traditional healers, pastors. When I say traditional healers, do you guys know what that means? Some people mistakenly call them witch doctors. Okay, so we work with government leaders, chiefs, women's groups, families, and so on. And when we do that, we transform those beliefs and they take action. And I'm going to show you more details on that in a second. But here's an example of a little girl. She's the cutest girl in the world. Her name is Zainabu, and she was in a really far-reaching rural area. And she's nonverbal. She has cerebral palsy. She wasn't able to walk or anything. And the thing in this picture is actually the first conversation that she had with her mom, because we were able to record some common greetings in one of those big buttons. So she actually said to her mom, "How are you?" through the button, the pre-recorded button, and her mom answered, "Fine." And it made me really teary-eyed just to see that, to see what can be opened up when people realize they can communicate through other means. But what happened in this area is we had a pastor workshop, we had a traditional healer workshop, we had a government leaders workshop, and then we had a parent workshop. What happened is these community leaders went and found these families, about 76 families that had children with disabilities. And so because disability, it's not like you just go around and you see all these people with disabilities. A lot of times they're hidden away because of the shame, because of the stigma. And so we need these community leaders to find them. So we brought together these 76 families. Zainabu was one of them. And we talked to them about their rights and what they learned. We always say, okay, they have the right to go to school. But what they found is there were no schools close enough that had the ability to teach these children, that needed not just teaching, but also accessibility and physical therapy as well. And so these community leaders got together with some local businesses and the government, and they decided to build a school, and they did. So one day, our physical therapist actually said Zainabu actually has a lot of potential to be able to walk one day, even though she wasn't at the time that we met her. And so it's kids like this when we think about all the other numbers that are important. And that's where I think advocacy, which is an area I know you guys have talked a lot about, I know that's one of Dr. Quissell's focuses, is advocacy to me is like this beach full of starfish. You've probably heard the story of the man walking along the shore, and he's throwing the starfish into the water one at a time. And someone says, "Oh, that's crazy. Like, why would you do that? You're never going to be able to save all of them." And the guy said, "Yeah, but it matters for the one I threw back, right?" I would say that advocacy is not about throwing the starfish in, it's about figuring out why so many are washed up on the shore. And so in our case, we've realized that the reason that there are so many kids washed up on the shore that are not getting services is because of that stigma and discrimination. And if we can change the belief system, we can really, really make a difference. And we're starting to see how that's working. We're actually getting to a point where collecting data to support this. So this is kind of a little picture of how we do it. This is Kupenda in the middle, obviously needing people with disabilities in the middle of it as well. Working with groups like pastors, traditional healers, business and government people, women's groups, other families, and disabled persons organizations as well. And then when they change the stigma, when they are actually taking action, you can reach so many more people with disabilities and really make a difference in their lives. And the strategy is through one-day workshops. We have some other things, but the thing that has really been making a difference is these one-day workshops that are unique to the leader type. So we have different workshops based on the different kind of leader they are. Dr. Quissell did research on our traditional healer workshop, which is something that really hasn't been done. Not many people have really worked with traditional healers around the belief system. A lot of people are actually a little nervous to work with them. But if you get a chance to meet them, like this guy himself, when I see him, he gives me a really big hug. And then, for pastors, when we work with the pastors, we're talking about what does the Bible say about taking care of children with disabilities, and it's not just about healing, it's also about medical intervention. When we speak with government leaders, we use the law, say, what does the law say? What is your responsibility? We've also started working with interfaith groups. And right before the pandemic hit, we'd been meeting with a group of Muslim leaders about using our pastor workshop model to say a similar strategy, but using the Quran. And of course, because we're not a Muslim organization, we wouldn't be able to lead it. but we can work with those leaders. And they actually came through the interfaith workshop. Those Muslim leaders came to one of our pastor workshops with a group of pastors that were already working in the interfaith group. And they said, oh, we can totally see how this could work in our context. So they've developed it. We haven't been able to test it because of the pandemic. But all of our discussions are locally led, respectful and discussion based, and community centered in action planning. So every workshop that we do at the end, we ask them to get into small groups by region and to say, okay, now that we've talked about this, we address things like the causes of disabilities. We talk about what does their text, whether it's the law or their religious text, what does it say about disability? And what does your community say? And what can you do at the end? What can your community do and what can you do? And they come up with a lot of creative solutions to change things. And what we found in a study is that 63% of our participants who had negative beliefs around disability, saying they thought it came from curses or witchcraft or anything like that, they actually 63% based on our pre and post test said that they changed their beliefs from superstitious to biological. And that's just in a one-day workshop. 65% of the participants were showing that they were actually supporting children with disabilities afterwards. And when we say supporting, and I would say I put more value in what they're actually doing as opposed to what they're saying they believe. But what they're doing is they're identifying and visiting children, counseling them, saying what their rights are. We always give them informational guides, like a disability guidebook, which explains different disabilities, their causes, descriptions, interventions, in a really simple, easy to read language. Or they're referring them to schools, establishing parent support groups. They're actually opening schools, like I mentioned with Zainabu, doing talks in what we call chief barazas, which are like community forums, or even in their churches or mosques. They're providing food relief during the pandemic. We've had many children, they're home from school, they need food relief, and they're also changing policy, which impacts so many children. We actually just had the local community level Kalifi County Disability Act passed, and that was with a lot of the push from our community leaders and staff. But basically after a workshop, one active leader in a year, just one, can sensitize over 300 community leaders and directly support 24 children. So if you have one workshop with 25 leaders, that results in 384 children with disabilities having improved lives, whatever that might mean for that child. Keep in mind, probably half of the kids that we're working with don't actually need specialized services. They just need to know they're allowed to go to a mainstream school, that they should have the right to do that. And now we're going global. We're not just in Kenya, we're now in Zambia, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Uganda. I think it's supposed to be, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Haiti. And that's because we're partnering with organizations working on the ground and sharing our models that these organizations can take on and use. And so Kupenda and Kenya continues to be what we call our innovation center. There's always places to improve, but at the same time, we're trying to document our work in such a way that other people can use it and share it, because these days, groups like USAID are requiring disability inclusion to be part of development efforts, but a lot of organizations we've met with have realized that it's just difficult. They're overwhelmed by the idea. And we believe we have a very simple to implement, cost-effective and successful methodology to increase inclusion, because if you don't change the mindset around disability, it's not going to matter how beautiful of a hospital or a school you have if children are locked in back rooms and tied to trees, undergoing painful healing rituals. So with that, I'm going to leave some room for some questions at the end. If you want to contact us, here's how to do so. And I'm sure Dr. Quissell can add a lot to this later too, if you have any questions. And I would imagine, and I didn't ask this before, but I know as I'm speaking, there are people on this call that either have disabilities or have close family members with disabilities as well. So if you feel like sharing about that, please feel free to.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for questions, and then Cynthia does have to leave at 3. I've got a couple of things we can talk about from 3 to 3:15. But if you have specific questions for her, please go ahead and raise your Zoom hand. Otherwise, I also have questions that I can ask, but I'll open it up to you all first since we only have about 10 more minutes. Something that you would like to hear more about? Yeah, John.
Hey Cynthia, the question I was curious about is, I know you mentioned that working to export that model from Kenya to other countries, and I was curious if I know we talked a little bit earlier about differences between low income and like the U.S. As different countries, and I was curious if there were any ways you saw like Kupenda's work translating into countries like the U.S.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. Strangely enough, I have been asked to speak to several groups here in the United States around disability issues. And I have found that my context for disability, even though I grew up without a hand and technically had a disability, I wasn't part of like a disability group or an effort or any of that kind of thing. But once I didn't realize when I was started working in Kenya, I'd come back and share stories, and people who had children, say, with severe cerebral palsy would say, oh yeah, that happens to me too. Or someone who had a child with autism, like, oh yeah, that happens to me. My child got kicked out of church because they were behaving badly. So I found that there's actually more commonality. And so not just one, but one of the things that I find to be what I enjoy so much about Kenyan culture, which is similar in many low-income countries, is their community and how they connect with one another. And one of the things that Kenya has and other countries like it is, once you change the stigma, there's already a community in place to help. And we've seen families that once the stigmas change, mothers are taking care of each other's children and so on. But in the United States and countries like the United States, we've lost that. And so what you'll find is many families, especially with children with disabilities that are dependent on the parents for most of their life, they don't have that community structure. We live in isolated family units more and more. And so we talk about how can we recreate what we have in Kenya. So it's a continual learning back and forth between the different types of countries, because I think that we all have different kinds of challenges when it comes to disabilities, but they're all challenges nonetheless. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Yeah, John, that actually was, I was going to ask Cynthia to talk about something similar, because that was one of the things we chatted about a lot when we were both in Kenya together, where certain dynamics within the local communities here in Kenya that really help facilitate inclusion. That once people have, greater knowledge and have opportunity to talk about, stigma and to, sort of engage with it, and the work that Kupenda does to mitigate it. Once that's, overcome, that inclusion in many ways just seems much easier done in communities that are already very much centered around community inclusion participation. So it's some of those communitarian norms and values that we've talked about in class go, a really long way in helping. So thank you for bringing up that question. Any other questions? I thought maybe Cynthia, Courtney, we'll go to you first, and then if we have time, we'll go to my question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you noticed anything about the intersectionality between race and disability, especially since you've worked in different countries.
I was actually just going to say that. I was going to talk about how disability, we have to keep in mind, is intersectional, is that people with disabilities are also people of color, people of different genders, people of different sexual orientations. You can be all the things at one time, because often we focus on one. But I would say one of the things that is true when we're working in African countries, obviously the people there are all of color. You don't see as much of racial dynamics immediately within the communities, but I actually was a participant in this documentary called Crip Camp. There was a discussion group afterwards, and they made sure that every person that was kind of the speaker was someone of color, usually someone that was not cisgender or heterosexual, was usually someone not that way, and also had a disability, usually multiple disabilities as well, to again talk about how it's a lot of different things that affect a person. You're not just one-dimensional. And so I think that in communities, one of the things I've learned is that in communities of, say, when we're doing racial, let's say a protest around Black Lives Matter, people with disabilities have complained that in the planning of a Black Lives Matter protest, they weren't included, those who had, say, accessibility issues because they were in a wheelchair. And on the other side, there have been people that have planned, say, a protest around disability or some kind of movement, and people of color had said that they weren't represented. That was basically white people with disabilities. And so they end up being discriminated against in both ways. But one thing that I've found really to be true among most people of marginalized groups is that they tend to be more sensitive to other marginalized groups. My favorite part of the Crip Camp documentary is they were able to communicate using sign language because no one else knew it, to like when they had their phone lines cut off, and that they were sensitive to other people with different kinds of disabilities. And I think it was Black Panthers actually supported the civil rights protests for disability when they were doing a shut-in. So I think that it's kind of interesting to see marginalized groups supporting one another. I don't know if you guys have seen that to be true, but I would say for myself, I think it's probably made me more sensitive to other marginalized groups myself.
See if there's any last questions, since we're getting close to 3 o'clock.
And it's okay if it's a couple minutes difference, but.
Okay. So another question is we've touched on a lot of topics related to the work that Kupenda does. One thing that I thought you might maybe talk about a little bit more, because I also remember us having a really interesting conversation with Madam Caro when we were in Kenya about sort of like the role of like volunteerism and volunteering, and how, you know, Americans traveling to Kenya for work, how there's certain ways in which it can be problematic, you know, taking some of the examples of like the Peace Corps volunteers who used to work with Kupenda versus better ways of doing work as a foreigner in a country like Kenya. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of volunteering, you know, going in like the bad direction versus also better ways of thinking about working in countries outside of your own.
Yeah, I think that when people go to other countries to help with the sincere motivation to help, I think that people forget that they need to learn first. And people, like I've met with groups of volunteers of people from the United States that are coming to work in situations that they have no experience in whatsoever, and not working in the appropriate ways either, because there's always local leadership and local people that can be collaborated with. And what often happens, especially on the coast, because you have so many Westerners coming as tourists and coming to live like in the winter time and so on, there's this culture that's been created that's negative for both sides, where you'll see that the local community starts to expect that all people with white skin should be giving them money in some way or another. And then you'll see the white people coming, specifically in this case, it's usually white people that are saying, oh, let me help. And they're basically throwing money at people, which is disrespectful in some ways as well. So they're kind of feeding off of each other in terms of that charitable model. One of the reasons that I believe we're so successful in our work is that we're able to, people are not paid to come to our workshops. They're very low cost, and they come because they want to. And then we are always saying, hey, you guys are from this culture. Like I'm no longer really leading any of the workshops anymore. That they come from here. This is something that they need to, that and they'll say it's their responsibility. They know it. And because we have a facilitated discussion, we have them, they're really the ones speaking most of the time and sharing their ideas. And so they're empowered to do the work and not just to depend on not even just outsiders, but on nonprofits, because sometimes they can go and just depend on the local nonprofit to do everything when there's so much more. And most of them are affected by disability in some way or another, whether it's a family member or themselves. So they understand they can have that kind of empathy. I think that might have answered. I think it's just I think the biggest thing, I think I think everyone should experience other cultures. I just think that when someone goes to another culture, they need to have the mindset of learning first and experiencing and just asking questions. But in order to, it was like knowing, a friend of mine just said, always know what your area is, like what's your lane, like speak to what you know, don't speak to what you don't know. Because I've had volunteers come and like, well, why don't you just do this? I'm like, well, they can't, like, why don't you just plant a tree farm and then it'll take care of everything? I'm like, because there's not enough water. And oh, thank you for coming and sharing this idea that's going to save us all, right? Instead of asking questions from the local people, like, can trees grow here? Here's my experience. And like, I have found that families, whether they have disabilities or have children with disabilities, have been some of the most effective volunteers, because what they have said is when they've come and talked to our families in Kenya, especially, they have found that they're really connecting over disability issues, and that the cultural barriers are broken down and they really feel like they're equals. So when you guys go out, just remember to learn first. There's always, I'm still learning myself, and it's been a while since I've been doing this work. So thank you guys. It was really nice to meet you all. I'm sorry I have to pop out, but I hope you have a good discussion. And if Dr. Quissell, you have any more thoughts to share with me later, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. So please join me in thanking Cynthia for joining us today. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'll be seeing you next week, I think, at our advisory board meeting.
Oh, that's right. Okay, see you later. Yeah, let me know what you guys talk about. Thanks.
I will, absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Take care. So in the last little bit of class, what I wanted to share with you a little bit more, because we'll actually talk about it a bit next week, is I wanted to give you a little bit more information on Kupenda's intervention model. So I worked out with Cynthia that she would give you sort of an overview of the programmatic work, but I could talk a little bit about some of the research I've been doing with them with their traditional healer workshops. And some of the strategies they use for stigma mitigation have been really effective. And so one of the things that I did when I was visiting was I observed some of their workshops, saw, Leonard in particular with his workshop moderation and some of the techniques he was doing to get people to talk about very uncomfortable and topics and very deeply held beliefs. And then the way he would approach these discussions that would get people to really question and challenge their own deeply held beliefs. It was really phenomenal to see in person. And some of the techniques that he used are similar to things you will find in some social psychology literatures. And we'll actually talk about some of these again in more depth next week, but I wanted to give you some examples of what that looks like. So typically when Leonard starts his workshops, he takes people through an exercise where he describes an experience of one of the kids that Kupenda had found a couple years ago of, a child who had been sort of left at home alone, kept in the bedroom. The family was doing it out of concern for the child because of the community stigma, was afraid to take the child outside of the house. And so Leonard sort of like talked them through, what would it feel like for you to be left alone in a bedroom with like minimal food, minimal contact with your family, unable to go out and enjoy your community. So this sort of like visualization exercise, which you might hear referred to as a form of perspective taking. And so he does these like really, really beautiful illustrations of lived experience with some of the kids in their network, and has people sort of think through, put themselves in the shoes of this child, and then talk about what that experience would be like. So that's how he sort of opens up these workshops. Also, what they typically do is invite a community member who is a person with a disability, similar to, what Cynthia was saying. She used to do this for their workshops, where she would, describe her life as a person with a disability and sort of ask people those questions about what do they think she can and can't do. So they now typically use one of their Kenya network members to do a similar thing. And then they, it's as a way of sort of showing that actually, even with this disabilities, I'm still capable of many of the things that you think that I can't do, I actually can do. And it fosters conversation, and it gives these workshop members or participants an opportunity to ask questions and to have greater interaction with a person living with a disability than they probably have had before. And this is an example of what's called intergroup contact theory. And this addresses some of the in-group, out-group concerns that we've been talking about, and this week in particular around stigma. That part of both, instrumental and symbolic stigma is not having enough experience with people that you see as other. And so by breaking down by those barriers, by facilitating and allowing for greater experience and interaction, and very positive interactions, because these conversations are moderated like really brilliantly by Leonard, and by the guest speakers that they invite to the workshops. And then one of the other things that they do is, because they've been working for such a long time, they have a really strong alumni network of community leaders and others who've attended trainings. And so for the traditional healer workshops that I observed, they would have one of their traditional healer leaders who had previously attended workshops, who's now a disability rights advocate, come and speak about how they changed their traditional healing practices and how it made them better traditional healers, how they've been able to get more kids into health clinics, the health benefits they've seen in their communities, ways that they can use traditional healing, like herbal remedies that are beneficial for disabilities. Like, for example, there are some common herbal remedies in this area of Kenya that are really effective fever reduction agents. And so for kids that are experiencing like malaria or other infections that can cause disability, like fever reduction is very useful, particularly if it's in the interim while you're trying to get kids to clinics. And so they're also coming up with ways of using the aspects of traditional medicine that are useful while trying to get people to abandon practices that are harmful. So they are able to sort of maintain prestige for these healing professions while also facilitating referrals to clinics. So they do this all. It's really brilliant to see, in real life, in real action. But they've been able to use these what's called like sort of in-group norm settings. You get highly esteemed members of the traditional healer population, or political leaders or other people like community leaders, to basically take on this role of advocacy themselves and explain the ways in which it's made their lives better and the lives of their community members better. And that helps establish, different in-group norms. So it's another way of getting at some of these in-group, out-group dynamics. And so they typically do all three of those things in their day-long workshops. So with some of the research I've been doing, we haven't yet been able to sort of get into like which part of it is most important, or which part has the most the largest effect on stigma reduction. But what we've been able to do is demonstrate through a sort of pre-test, post-test model, as well as a quasi-experimental field design where we had a control group that didn't get the intervention, that the impact of these interventions on stigma mitigation and reduction. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, we weren't able to collect our follow-up data because right when we were getting to sort of 1 month out, it's when Kenya shut down. So we don't have any of our longitudinal data that we were hoping to get, because we were hoping to measure and assess, whether or not beliefs changed and then were maintained, or if people reverted back, if it in some ways, because Kupenda also leaves them with additional materials and basically tasks them with, identifying children, if maybe their stigma even continues to go down even more over time. So we were trying to look for all of these different things, and we're unfortunately unable to at this point, but it's something that we hope to do. Basically, again, we'll have to rerun the entire experiment again once we're able to travel again. But that's some of the work that we've all been doing together. So I wanted to get you a little bit more sense of what these workshops look like, because it's really interesting work. So let me pause and see if you have any questions about their program model or about any of the research I've been doing or anything else I may not be able to answer as like directly as Cynthia, but I do know the work of their organization quite well. If you had any other questions about their team. All right, if not, we're getting close to the time of class. I just wanted to remind everybody that your worksheets for the policy project should be turned in on Friday. Next week, we're going to start talking about climate change and advocacy work continuing. I'll try to get you some time in Teams next week to start working on your issue brief. So we'll definitely go over the next assignment and the policy project in more detail next week. But if you have any questions on your worksheet, please send me emails. I know some of you are coming to see me in office hours today with questions. I still have some appointments available if you wanted to come see me in office hours right after class today. But otherwise, have a wonderful weekend. Stay well, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Professor Quissell, hey, I just had a quick question. I was just going to ask, I know